Survey of about 1,700 public employees. We're interested in the relationship between employee perceptions of diversity climate and their intent to turn over or leave the organization. We also want to look at 4 different psychological variables as underlying. Oh, sorry, did advance my slide. We wanted to look at the role of 4 psychological variables in underlying the relationship between perceptions of diversity climate as well as turnover, which were organizational commitment, climate for innovation, psychological empowerment, and something we call identity freedom, or employees feeling like they can be themselves. They can bring their whole selves to work, to use the title of one of my other colleagues. Now, we studied employees' perceptions about what diversity practices were like there. And we thought that it's important to study employee perceptions because employees observe what happens to them and form perceptions about what's valued. So in other words, there could be management practices in place, or management might have rhetoric around, we support diversity, we value diversity, but what do they actually do? So it's important not just to look objectively in terms of what practices are in place, is there a diversity officer, has there been training offered, but more so than that, to get employees' perceptions and to say, are these things effective? Does the organization actually value diversity? In terms of a climate for diversity, what we're talking about are employees' perceptions of whether organizational practices provide fair treatment and equal access to opportunities. So fair treatment and equal access will be 2 important components that I'll talk about. So previous literature has conceptualized that when it comes to employees thinking about, well, how are things around here for people of different backgrounds? What they think about are in terms of 2 main things. Fair treatment, how do people treat one another, how do they get along, how are relationships, and then equal access to opportunities. So when you're looking at the structure of the organization, is there diverse representation at all levels? Are there opportunities for mentoring, for career development, for succession planning, for leadership? So that when you're looking at kind of the upper levels or the C-suite of the organization, it's great to say, yes, we value diversity, but if it's all white male executives, well, maybe not. So fair treatment and equal access. Now, other people have taken a more differentiated approach, is to say, yes, there's these 2 major dimensions, but we could break it down into as many as 6 different dimensions that, again, constitute people's perceptions of a climate for diversity. And so the suggested dimensions are structural integration, what I talked about, the degree to which there's diverse representation at all levels of the organization, integration in informal networks so that people of different backgrounds are socializing and interacting in an informal way, inside and outside of work. Low cultural bias, that generally it's an organization that's free from discrimination or discriminatory practices. Intergroup cohesion, kind of the positive feelings that different groups have for one another. Acculturation, the degree to which people feel like they can bring their own culture versus having to acculturate or assimilate into a host culture. And then organizational identification, the extent to which people have an emotional attachment to the organization and take on the organization's problems as their own.
Do you mind questions in the middle?
Please do, absolutely.
The top part of this slide starts to look like the organizational justice literature. The bottom part is older, so maybe that's why it doesn't, it's different. Maybe it's more sociological on the left and psychological on the right or something like that. To what extent do the literatures of organizational justice and diversity climate talk to each other?
Oh, so that's a great question. Probably not as much as they should. I think that these things are somewhat siloed, and so you just notice an overlap that I actually hadn't. So yeah, that's an interesting observation. Yeah.
The answer to your question is not much. Actually, I remember 2 years ago, Dr. Friedman and I, we made a presentation and we talked about the relationship between org justice and diversity literature. There's not much, although you would intuitively think.
Yeah.
There, yes. So,
But there's, with treatment and then access, it seems like there's a very clear parallel there. Yeah. Yes.
So that the students know what we're talking about, should we say what the key organizational justice dimensions are? The first two that I see up there, fair treatment, is called procedural justice. Equal access to opportunities sounds quite a bit like distributive justice. And then there are a couple more. There's informational justice and...
interactional justice.
And what's interactional justice?
It's how you're treated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Will you say those four again?
Procedural justice is fair treatment, like fair treatment. Equal access is like distributive justice. How well are the goodies shared equally? So like equal access to opportunities, or more likely equal outcomes. Then informational justice. Do you get information when you need it, or there are some groups that get the information when they need it, but you don't? And then interactional justice is, are you treated humanely, like a full human being in interactions between you and leaders in the organization, or people who in your mind represent the organization? Back to you, Nick.
Thank you. And I think there's potentially argument in that field as well, although you could identify more granular dimensions as you have it. It kind of potentially rolls up to two things. It's how you're treated and then that's what you get.
Yeah.
So thank you for the observation. That's and Denise as well. Yeah, it's kind of my impression that these two worlds, as in many cases in academia, we don't talk to each other as much.
Yeah.
And if you want to write an interesting lit review, what you do is you take the insights from one set of literature and apply it to the problems in another, and find solutions that nobody else saw, and voila, you've got a great lit review.
And then the dissertation is yeah, you're going to come out over the weekend. So, what we wanted to do, so given that some people say, oh, it really just boils down to two things, is when people have, what's climate diversity, what do I have in mind? It's how are people treated, and then, what do people get? But some people are saying, no, it's people think in a much more differentiated way. One goal of the research was to say, well, let's try to determine, if we can, methodologically, how many things people are thinking about, and whether we can just kind of boil it down to these two broad dimensions, or whether people are thinking about multiple things. We wanted to test a couple hypotheses that we had. One is that there would be a negative relationship between perceptions of an affirming climate for diversity and turnover, meaning that the more people thought that, hey, this is a good climate for diversity, differences are valued, the less likely they would be to say that I'm going to leave my organization. And that, again, the 4 psychological variables that I mentioned would underlie this overall relationship here. And then we also want to examine subgroup differences. So whether the patterns that we found above were consistent for white men, white women, and non-white employees. We had to do this grouping based on, unfortunately, a organization that was itself not very diverse. So this organization was a very white organization, for lack of a better word, lots of white men, white women. So we had to, unfortunately, for purposes of statistical analyses and statistical power, group together employees that were non-white. So this is not ideal in many respects, but for statistical purposes, we need to do just in terms of a breakdown, so these were city employees. They came from a large municipality, over half of police officers, heavily male-dominated and as well as white. So you can form whatever conclusions you will about the generalizability of our results from our demographics. Most were between 36 and 45 and had 6 to 10 years of experience on the job. So in terms of, sorry about that. In terms of measuring diversity climate, so what was it, how do we measure it? First, perceptions that the workplace had low cultural bias. Okay, there. My animations is very bad, beg your pardon. So the perception that the workplace is free from bias, prejudice, and discrimination. So for instance, one of our survey items said something like, I have sometimes been unfairly singled out because of the demographic group that I belong to, or prejudice exists where I work. So what we did is we scored those so that if they answered that way, that would indicate that there was high cultural bias, and we just reverse scored those items to represent low cultural bias. Intergroup cohesion, the relationships between members of different groups are free from tension. So we ask questions like, there are close relationships between members of different groups, or when there's conflict between workers of different groups, others tend to take the side of their own group. Informal integration had to do with the perception of equal access and inclusion in social and informal networking. So we asked questions along the lines of, there are informal functions where some demographic groups are made to feel unwelcome, or I feel excluded from casual conversations with members from other groups. And then finally, structural integration, which is the perception of equal representation at different levels. So there are questions that we asked, just then these are examples. Minority input is effectively considered at all levels, and the people that I work with represent a wide variety of backgrounds. So psychological outcomes, we measured organizational identification, which is just the positive emotional attachment and personal identification with the goals of the organization. Empowerment, the perception that employees are allowed to make decisions about their own work. Climate for innovation, the perception that new ideas are allowed and encouraged. And identity freedom, perception that employees can fit in without having to change who they are. In terms of that last scale, we ask questions like, I feel like I can be myself at work. I feel like I can fit in without having to change who I am.
First, I think of Apple when you say that, because I just feel like every walk of life is an employee of Apple. You have that experience when you walk into a store, because it's almost like you can see people from all around the world that are all under one company umbrella.
Yeah. Interesting. And so this kind of aspect of it stood out for you?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And they totally own who they are. I mean, they can even, everyone wears a blue Apple shirt, but then all their other accessories, whether they have earrings or funky colored hair or whatever it is, like they get to just totally be themselves at work.
Yeah, so this is, and I'm glad you're talking about it now, because just to kind of spoil the story, we found that this ended up, at least in my opinion, ended up being one of the most important variables in our model, of saying that the reason that employee perceptions of whether the organization has a climate that supports diversity is important is because when people feel that way, that the organization supports diversity, they feel like they can be themselves, and then all the good stuff happens. Then people feel empowered, then they feel like they can be innovative, and they don't feel like they want to leave them up for another problem. So, that was the punchline. I'll hit you with it again. Yes.
Just going along with that example, how would you characterize the organization that's the other extreme?
Can you say, oh!
An organization,
Yeah.
what are the characteristics of an organization where perceptions of identity freedom is very low? perceptions of innovation, or what are the elements of such an organization?
Yeah, so I think it revolves around